B, 0, I, 23 of 10000 megabytes. P, 134. T, all, 16 allocated memory, 99%. Multiplayer chunk CAC, 441, 53 billion megabytes. X, 433.25627, 433, C, 27, 1. Y, 4000, feet pose, 5460 eyes pose. Z, 816,49079, minus 817, C, minus 52, 15. F, 3, east, minus 89.99522. LC, 15B, planes BL, 0 SL, 15 RL, 15. WS, 0.100, FS, 0.050, G, true FL, 4. Even being a computer geek, Norman never knew exactly what all of the data meant, but he did see that all of the numbers there was exactly like the data one could open using the F3 key on one's computer keyboard. Norman looked around for his position and found that amongst the confusing numbers and variables it indeed showed that he was currently in the plains biome. He pressed the F3 and it clicked back up. The data in front of him disappeared in a swirl of static. After this was done, he nodded at Professor Chickenson and said, "Thanks. I guess I don't need to worry, then." Professor Chickenson hopped back up onto his cane and balanced before replying. "You are welcome, my dear boy. Now then, is there something else that you must do before you leave on your upcoming journey?" he asked. Before Norman could say anything, Danny spoke up from behind in a rude tone. "Hey, meat hunk. You should be a pork chop, you know. That way you might actually serve a purpose besides walking around with that stupid cane," he exclaimed. Professor Pigson didn't react the slightest bit annoyed to Danny's insult, but instead replied with something equally offensive. "Yes, I understand that being rejected is hard on you, but trying to gain approval from insulting others is not the correct approach. Perhaps all this has gone to your head. May I consult Dr. Squidson for you? He is an excellent psychiatrist and could help you with your, how should I say, problems?" For a moment Danny looked like his head was going to explode. Suddenly, he stood up and tried to run at the professor. "Why, I oughta." Jeff and Hillary had to grab both his arms to prevent him from seriously maiming Professor Pigson. Even then, he was mere inches from the professor, but the professor in no way acted startled, and he looked back at Norman through Danny's legs. "He's a pig, so that's really not that hard with his size. Now young chap, is there anything that you desire from us now that we have given you our compass and our knowledge? I do not mean this with bad intentions, I simply must ask before you go forthwith into the hazardous jungle," he inquired. Norman still was confused on how they really ended up where they were, but he thought about that for a few seconds and decided on his answer. "Actually, I think we're fine now, Professor." He stood up and gently pulled Danny back into place, who grumbled and swore a couple of times. "Thanks for the F3 and that secret passage idea." Professor Pigson waved and replied with, "Ah, you are welcome, my dear boy. Have a pleasant journey." Norman ushered everyone else who was still sitting to stand, and they began to file out of the room. Norman led everyone through the doorway and he was about to go himself when suddenly he felt a hoof on his shoulder. Professor Sheepson was near him, looking very old and depressed for some reason. "My boy," he uttered with a very tired voice, clearly he was the oldest of the society. "I must ask you of a favor." Norman hadn't seen Professor Sheepson talk at all in his visit, but he replied politely. "What is it, Professor Sheepson?" The professor coughed and leaned heavily on his cane, but kept his hoof on Norman's shoulder. He cleared his throat and managed to straighten up a bit. "If you find my son, Tell him that I am waiting. Tell him that we must meet immediately," he muttered softly, staring blankly into Norman's eyes, which Norman noticed were very pale with almost no color, colored a milky white. Norman suddenly felt uncomfortable standing there, and he stepped back and nodded vigorously while walking through the doorway. "Yes, sir. I will, try and find your son." He quickly escaped from the elder sheep's demented stare and climbed up the stone staircases to the ladder. He exited the house and found everyone waiting for him outside. "Norman, what were you doing down there? You wasted a whole minute. We might actually need that time, idiot," yelled Danny, who was also giving him a stare, only this one was menacing instead of creepy. Norman quickly noticed a pattern with Danny. If he were even a minute late for anything, Danny would be the first person to point it out, but when Danny made the mistake, he went out of his way to stubbornly deny everything. Norman didn't feel like coming up with a comeback, so he just walked right past and looked out towards the jungle. They still had 3 mutants left to kill. Chapter 23, Two Sweet Occurrences. Norman was about to declare that they were setting out into the jungle when he saw that everyone was crowding around someone shouting like a bunch of vultures hovering over a kill. Norman ran forward and investigated, and found that everyone was gathered around Quinn. Once he squeezed through well enough to see, he muttered woe at the thing sitting before Quinn. Someone had placed a block of dirt right in front of Quinn. There on the block sat a dragon egg that Quinn was inspecting. It was very odd, because this egg was colored snow white for the most part, but with cream-colored spots. It was almost the exact opposite color scheme of a regular dragon egg. Quinn looked up at Norman quickly and said, "Dude, look at this thing. I was really bored when you guys were talking down there with those old guys and I snuck up here. But all I could do to entertain myself was create a bunch of dragon eggs and drop them all over. Suddenly, I saw this egg sitting in between 2 normal ones, but when I tried taking it away, it wouldn't go away. I kept trying but it sat there without going. I don't know why it's colored this way, either." Norman bent down on his knee and inspected the dragon egg himself. As he got close to it, he found that a sugary smell was wafting up from it in a warm mist. He noticed that the spot of cream color were actually holes, and they were dripping something gooey. He dipped his finger in a bit that fell out and sniffed it. It smelled like the same sugary smell that the whole egg had. Experimentally, he put a tiny drop on his tongue and suddenly he got a taste of creamy dough. Norman stared at the egg with complete confusion. For some reason, Quinn must have created a white chocolate egg somehow. Lizzie came forward and quickly put her hand in the cream-colored hole and scooped out a handful of the gooey dough. She guzzled it down and muttered, "More. This stuff is good." Norman grabbed her ready wrist and prevented her from reaching again into the egg. "Hold on there, Lizzie. You're energetic enough as it is. You'd be a sugar-buzzed squirrel if you ate any more of that. Besides, it's scoop coming from an egg. That's disgusting," he added. Lizzie shrugged and replied with this, "Well, it tastes good." Norman heard a couple of people gasp and he looked back at the egg. More hot mist was hissing out of the holes, and suddenly the top cracked open and the entire shell slid off. This spluttered a considerable amount of white chocolate over the group, but Norman wiped the substance from his eyes and stared at the broken egg. In the white goop left in the broken egg shell stood a mini dragon that was only as big as a quarter of a block. It looked exactly like an Ender dragon, only it was made of pure white chocolate with cream-colored wings and eyes. It was sitting in a graceful position. Quinn reached forward and said, "Cool. Look, it's a chocolate Ender dragon sculpture." Quinn reached out and tried to pick up the minifigure, but it hissed at him and he pulled his hand back. The chocolate figure came to life and tried to make its way through the chocolate goop around it. Everyone backed up as it jumped down off the dirt block it was sitting on. The mini dragon stretched and its tiny mouth let out a yawn, its tongue curling far back so that it's practically down its throat. In real life, that's what my dog looks like when she yawns. Quinn was only frozen for a second, but then he slowly reached forward and put his hand out to the creature. It looked at him for a few seconds, but then crawled slowly onto his palm. Quinn barely lifted up the mini chocolate dragon, but it tilted its head and let out a little high-pitched croaking sound. Norman heard just about every girl in the group go at that moment. Quinn looked pretty excited himself. Wow! I'm a daddy. Danny walked forward and snorted when he saw the dragon. A daddy to that ugly reptile? Yeah, right. The dragon responded to his comment by spitting a glob of sugary dough in his face. He wiped away his eyes and squinted at the small white dragon, which had rolled over on its back and started hissing repeatedly as though it were laughing at him. Danny's face could be seen reddening even through the goop, and he launched himself forward to strangle the creature. But both the dragon and Quinn moved out of the way in time, and Danny instead plunged face first into the eggshells and extra goop dough. Norman looked back and saw that most people looked like they were about to laugh their guts out, but they were all too scared to do so. Norman looked back at Quinn and his chocolate dragon. He was watching the thing walk around stretching its wings, but he didn't look comfortable yet. Norman slowly slipped through the crowd and approached him. Before he got a chance to say anything, Quinn looked up and beat him to the chase. Okay, now I've got to take care of a dough-spewing dragon. What am I supposed to do if the thing gets eaten? I'll be cursed with guilt my whole life. As if on cue, the dragon stretched its neck over and took a big bite out of its right wing. Quinn gasped and said, "What? Don't do that. Stop, you're gonna eat yourself to death, or something." But just as suddenly as the wing had been bitten, the chunk missing regenerated instantly, good as new with no marks. The dragon let out a tiny burp and suddenly it grew to twice its size. Now it was half the size of an average block. Quinn stood up and stared at the chocolate dragon in amazement. "Oh, cool. I won't have to worry about feeding you. You know, I'm gonna name you something. Let's see." He sat down again, cautiously patted the small dragon on the head. It also lay down and looked at him curiously. He kept going. For a while. The dragon rolled over and lay on its back, and he rubbed its belly. The dragon curled around, enjoying the belly rub. Norman was vaguely reminded of Butterball, and it suddenly hiccuped and sent a spray of sugary white dough into Quinn's hair. He looked down and tried shaking the substance from his hair, but then he looked at the dragon and grinned when he noticed that its stomach was covered in a slick layer of the dough. "I'm gonna call you Doughbelly. Yeah, that sounds good," he decided, feeling proud about his choice. Apparently, Doughbelly liked the choice too, because it jumped up and started running around Quinn in circles. Lizzie ran over at this time and stared at Doughbelly. "Oh my Pop-Tart. That thing is more hyped up than me. Cool." Doughbelly stopped and looked up at her, then promptly spit dough in her face. Lizzie scraped off the dough and started eating it. "Can he fly?" Norman felt a hot breath on his back and whirled around. Danny was standing there, looking as menacing as ever. "How about we throw it off a cliff and find out?" he suggested. At this time, Doughbelly hissed at him and then leapt gracefully up onto Danny's forehead, practically drowning him in dough. Danny's cries were blocked by the big mass of dough that was now around his head, and Norman was amused at the sight of him running around frantically to get Doughbelly off. Then he remembered that they had a jungle to explore. Norman stood up and turned around, and saw that everyone was just talking or sharpening their weapons to pass the time. Norman coughed loudly and everyone looked in his direction. "Okay, I think that with the chocolate dragon, his name's Doughbelly, by the way, and the gentler mobs, we've had enough distractions. Now we've got to start our journey to find their zombie clan." Norman turned around and pointed into the trees. "Inside that jungle. But, we're going to have to travel underground and find a mine shaft with a dungeon connected to it. Once we find a dungeon, We'll each have to mine out pathways in all different directions, except the one we entered, to find a secret passage. Let's go. He finished. So that's just what they did. The entire group gathered together and stored all such supplies except for armor and weapons, and then headed quickly into the jungle ahead of them. Norman stayed in the back until they were all going forward, but then heard a noise behind him. He turned around and saw Professor Sheepson's blank stare drilling holes into his own eyes. He shivered and turned around. He almost wanted to find the old sheep's son just to prevent him from staring all the time. They entered the thick jungle within seconds, and immediately Norman had a sense of foreboding. He walked with his team for about 10 minutes of tiring jumps and hacking through vines and leaves. At one point, they all stopped to rest, and Norman took out a bottle of water and drank from it, careful to watch his thirst. Then, after eating a pork chop, he jumped up onto a leaf block from a ground-level tree. He looked up at what he could see of the sky. It was beginning to turn dark. Everyone eventually noticed him, but many people were healing up and getting situated, so that took another minute. Once he had everyone's attention, he declared, "Okay, I guess that we're far enough into the jungle to start traveling underground. Plus, nighttime's coming quickly, and we're going to have to build a room underground and settle for the night anyway." Quinn whipped out the diamond pickaxe he got from his strange dream back in the Serpent's Eye and started digging. 3 other people took out their iron pickaxes and helped Quinn dig a large room just underneath the ground, right under the dirt layer. Then Hillary quickly sealed up the entrance to the outside with their dirt, and Danny put up torches around the 15 by 17 by 2 room for light. Everyone set up their own bed, and Norman decided to take out his journal. It had felt like forever since he had written in it. Day 13, July 5th, 2415. Well, today was probably one of the weirdest we've ever experienced. First off, at something like 12:30 in the morning we had ourselves captured by the Spider Clan, and then they deep-fried one of our team members, which I am really annoyed had to be Esmeralda. Jeff can't possibly take any more of this, and then I figured out a use for my useless powers. Then, after Jeff stabbed the Spider Clan's mutant, which its name was Tangela, we were able to escape the place through a blasted hole that the Mecha Creeper made. Also, the Mecha Creeper is now Blackberry, because that's what Bailey picked. Then, only after about 10 minutes we met these mobs that could talk, and they wore top hats and monocles, and they sounded English for sure. They were the Society of Splendidly Knowledgeable Gentle Mobs, and they actually gave us this machine called the F3, which shows our exact position in the world. After we left those guys the day got even weirder and Quinn somehow hatched a chocolate dragon egg that yielded a white chocolate reptile that spits dough. Yeah, this was a pretty weird day. Although, now that we've been enriched by the logic of the gentle mobs we know what to do to find the next mob clan. We're going up against the zombie clan next, and it looks like we'll be traveling underground for the most part. For my sake and my team's sake I desperately hope that we can all stay alive. Norman Cobweb. Norman shut his book with the feather pen inside and crawled underneath his covers. Their day was pretty exhausting, too, and that helped Norman to fall asleep quickly. The next morning, Norman woke up first and then shook awake Lizzie. They both woke up the rest of the group. Norman went to wake up Bailey, but when he turned around he saw her pulling on a shoe. Butterball was scratching his back up against the stone wall. "Oh, you're already up." Suddenly, Norman realized something extremely major that made his mind go off in another direction. Wait a minute. Where the heck is Blackberry? He can't possibly be fine up out there, can he? Bailey grinned and pulled out something from her other shoe before putting it on. She was holding a tiny block the size of a cheese cube, only it was colored gray with green dot in the middle. Did I mention that Blackberry can compress himself to really tiny sizes? She murmured as she started taking out her armor. If Norman had the physical capabilities, then his mouth would have dropped to the stone floor at that point. Norman took the cube and held it in his open palm. He was holding the mecha creeper. That giant metal monstrosity was now just a little cube in his hands. He felt like he was holding a weapon of mass destruction in his palm, and suddenly he felt afraid that he was going to drop it and blow up the whole jungle. He quickly gave the cube back and swallowed. "That's really cool," he muttered. Bailey put on her iron armor and then pocketed Blackberry. "I know, right? Who would have known? You should see what it looks like when he compresses himself, it's really cool," she replied. Once everyone was woken up, he gathered them around and then they began to dig down. With everyone mining stone with their pickaxes, Norman suddenly found himself listening to a whole symphony of block-breaking sounds. They all dug down for another minute, but then they hit a cave. And they also found themselves facing a skeleton. Quinn crouched down in front to avoid being skewered with the arrow, and Danny quickly killed it with his diamond sword. Everyone streamed through the hole into the cave, and torches were put up around them. Norman instantly heard a couple of creeper and spider hisses around him, and some skeleton clicks. Thankfully, with a group like theirs they were able to fight off all the monsters that came near. Bailey, however, had all the oncoming creepers ignore them because she didn't want a single one to die. The cave system stretched on for a while, and gradually they began to go deeper underground. At one point, they found themselves all standing on the ledge of a very small ravine with only water flowing beneath. Norman looked to his left and right, and his heart jumped when he saw a light coming from 30 blocks away. There was an abandoned mine shaft at the end of the ravine. Norman shouted and pointed in that direction, and they began to make their way. Danny wanted to hog as much gratitude from his peers as possible, so he volunteered to start making a path down the center of the ravine. They made their way onto the floor of the abandoned mine shaft within 2 minutes. Immediately, Norman felt something knock him down to the ground from behind. He realized it was a cave spider and smacked it upside its head, sending it down into the ravine, dying on contact with the stone ground. Norman stood up and took a breath, and then they all headed into the abandoned mine shaft. Norman suddenly realized that the cave spider only could have came from a monster spawner, and he quickly looked around the abandoned mine shaft. Sure enough, hidden behind a mini waterfall in between 4 small wooden pillars was a dungeon. Norman had 7 wait outside, not counting Blackberry, since it would be pointless for all of them to go inside. He, Lizzie, Quinn, Bailey, Butterball and Dope Ellie entered the dungeon full of cobwebs. Norman destroyed all the offending cobwebs with the swipe of his hand and then quickly destroyed the cave spider monster spawner. There were 2 chests inside the dungeon. Norman opened the one on the left and found the most bizarre items ever. In every slot of the chest was a cookie. He suspiciously took out the cookies and took the chest, then opened up the other one. Same result, a bunch of cookies were just sitting in the chest. Norman showed all the cookies to Lizzie, and her eyes lit up immediately. Oh. Lizzie tried to grab them, but Norman caught her arm. Lizzie, just think for a moment. If you found a bunch of cookies that randomly turned up inside dungeon chests and their original whereabouts were unknown, would you honestly eat one? Lizzie didn't even hesitate for a moment, and quickly snatched a cookie and shoved it in her mouth. Norman gasped and said, "Lizzie. They taste fine to me," she replied, her mouth full of cookie. Suddenly, Lizzie swallowed the cookie and suddenly her eyes became tinted with brown around her eyelids. She jumped forward and tried to grab more. More. Moo. Give me more. She screamed. Quinn grabbed her arms and pulled her back. Shine fell on the ground with a clatter. Lizzie was foaming at the mouth, and Norman freaked out so hard that he smacked her in the face with Shatter. Lizzie fell back onto the ground next to Shine and quickly sat up. Her nose now had a very large bruise, but she was calmed down and the tints around her eyes disappeared. Lizzie groaned and rubbed her nose where Shatter had hit her. "Oh. What the heck just happened?" she muttered confusedly. Norman looked down at all of the cookies in his hands. He then looked back at Lizzie and he helped her to her feet. "I have no idea, but you just turned into a cookie-eating freak and you tried to kill me for the cookies. I had to hit you with Shatter to wake you up. I'm really sorry. Just don't eat anymore," he apologized. Lizzie again stroked her nose and muttered. "What was in that cookie?" Bailey came in and interjected with, "I bet they're just a stupid trap to trick miners to eat until they were poisoned. Maybe this is a mod or something." Norman thought hard about what mod could have had this. Then he remembered about the really old mod called Crazy Cookies mod that had cookies that when eaten would possess and slowly poison you. Norman had a sudden fearful feeling and led them all back through the waterfall to where everyone else was standing. Norman told them all about the event back there, but no one could really focus anyway. Everyone was focused on the fact of finding the zombie clan. No one really thought that the cookies were important anyway. Even Norman couldn't think of a use for them. So instead of standing around figuring out what to do with the crazy cookies, he began to walk with the group behind him to find that zombie monster spawner. He wished he knew how long they would be down there, but there was still no telling. He didn't let that keep him back as he strode forward into the abandoned mineshaft's depths. Chapter 24, Food Fight. Norman always kept the F3 on to make sure they were underneath the jungle still. When he first turned it on, he was underneath the desert, so he had to go in a different direction to get back underneath the jungle. Once they were under again, they headed deeper and lower into the abandoned mine shaft. Every once in a while they would kill a zombie or skeleton. At one point they even killed an enderman and got an ender pearl. Norman thought that might be useful. Norman was getting impatient after a while, and he only had to take a brief glance at the rest of his team to see that they were thinking the same thing. Finally, though, after another 20 minutes of just wandering, Norman heard a gurgling noise and a groan to his right. There were 2 zombies coming at them from a nearby dungeon. Norman and Lizzie took the liberty of slaying the mobs. The same people entered this dungeon as the ones before, and sure enough there was a zombie monster spawner. Norman destroyed the monster spawner and then killed off a few leftover zombies. He looked around and noticed that the entire room was cobblestone except for 3 blocks missing from the back wall. While he was doing this, Lizzie was opening the chests. Lizzie came forward to Norman and showed him the stash. It was fairly normal: 2 bundles of wheat, a loaf of bread, an iron sword and a crushed-looking black C418-11 music disc. Norman put all the items in his inventory and looked over to see Bailey opening the other chest. She looked puzzled when she took out an enchanted block of cobblestone. "What's this supposed to be for?" she muttered. Butterball sniffed the cobblestone and then suddenly ran over to the 3 missing cobblestone blocks on the wall. Norman understood how to open the secret passage. "Here, let me try something," he said as he took the cobblestone from Bailey. Norman looked at the 3 blocks missing in the wall. He wasn't sure which one to pick, so he just picked the one on the right. When he placed it inside, something clicked and an arrow whizzed from out of the enchanted cobblestone and jammed in Norman's cheek. Norman fell back and yelled in pain. He winced as he pulled the arrow from his cheek, and now it was bleeding at a high rate. Norman looked in his block pack and quickly found a piece of white wool, which he pressed to his wound to stop the blood flow. Suddenly, the enchanted cobblestone started shooting even more arrows until the whole dungeon was filled with flying projectiles. "Take cover!" someone yelled. Norman held his diamond shovel to his face and all of the arrows hitting it ricocheted with rapid clicking sounds. He slowly made his way to a corner of the room where there weren't any arrows and took out his iron pickaxe. He quickly mined the enchanted cobblestone and then the arrows ceased. Now everyone outside came through into the room even if it was crowded. They had been watching from outside, apparently. Hilary came over to Norman and gave him a sponge for his cheek wound. Norman was reassured when he found that the sponge soaked up 3 times more than the wool. "Norman, are you okay? What happened in here?" asked Jeff, who quickly approached him. Norman was having a hard time talking, but he managed to say, "I dunno, I guess 3 of Thoshola Shartrapsh. Uck." Norman instead gave Jeff the enchanted cobblestone. He seemed like he could defend himself a lot better. Jeff looked at the other 2 holes and placed it in the middle one. Suddenly, Norman heard a click from behind him, and he turned just in time to see Stephanie disappear into a hole. Norman hobbled over and looked down. She had fallen down into a very dark hole with green smog wafting up from it. Norman expected the smog to be terrible, but for some reason it smelled delicious, delicious like a steaming hot bowl of chili. Norman went towards the hole and was so entranced by the smell he didn't even care that he fell right down inside. Norman fell so far down that eventually he landed in a very hot sauce. Norman broke the surface of the fluid and crawled onto a giant nearby spoon. What? Norman balanced himself on the gigantic spoon and realized that he was standing on the edge of a mega monster bowl of chili. Norman noticed that the amazing aroma had increased immensely. Norman looked around him and gasped. He was among a bunch of other giant foods. There were building-sized loaves of bread, a monster bowl of fruit with giant apples, bananas, grapes, etc., and a gigantic cake that Norman could have used to flatten a village with. Norman jumped off of the bowl of chili and landed on a smooth wooden surface. He looked around at some other giant foods, but when he noticed a giant bread knife sitting about 20 blocks away he realized where he was. He was standing in a giant kitchen on a wooden countertop. Norman looked up at the hole and his eyes followed the trail of green smoke, which led off into the distance where he couldn't see. There were giant torches everywhere, too, but not enough for him to see well. So he followed the green smoke. He had to descend off the giant counter for about 15 blocks to reach the stone ground. Norman followed the green smoke all the way to a giant wooden door. It slowly creaked open when he pushed it. Norman went through and immediately stepped down on a stone pressure plate. Without any time to react, Norman was barricaded in all 3 directions by some pistons and the door behind him locked shut. Poisonous gas hissed into the tiny space, and Norman was knocked out instantly. He woke up again sitting on a long table among other giant foods. He had an apple in his mouth. Norman took out the large apple and threw it behind him. The apple was jammed so far into his mouth that his jaw was aching. Norman looked around and was relieved when he saw the rest of his group escaping from other food-related traps. Quinn and Dobelli were emerging from a chocolate sculpture, Hilary was climbing from out of a sponge cake, and Bailey and Butterball were emerging from a giant pool of gravy surrounding a giant, snicker Butterball turkey. Norman had a strange urge to laugh at all the puns going on at once. He looked over to his right and noticed that Lizzie was digging her way out of the bottom layer of a giant cake. He kind of expected that one. Norman looked around and noticed that everyone else was Mia. Lizzie approached him and said, "Whoa! What happened? When you fell in that hole, all of us came in after you, but you weren't in sight. Then we all got trapped by a bunch of pistons and we were gassed, and now only, like, half of us are here. Where's Jeff and Stephanie and Danny and all those guys?" Norman shook his head and had a moment where all he could say was a mangle of random noises because he couldn't seem to start off his sentence. "I don't know," he finally exclaimed. Hilary came to him next and said, "Where is everyone?" Norman turned around and said, "I don't know." Norman felt a tap on his shoulder and whirled around to see Quinn holding Dobelli with one arm. "Hey, where'd everybody go?" "I don't know," screamed Norman. He regretted screaming instantly, because the wound from before widened in his cheek, and he had to grab another sponge to start soaking up blood. Bailey and Butterball came over and Bailey noticed Norman's frustrated look. She was about to ask where everyone else was when Lizzie nudged her arm. "Don't ask, he doesn't know," she murmured. Suddenly, a booming voice echoed from far away in the dark of beyond. "Well, what do we have here?" Norman yelped as two giant green hands clasped around him and hoisted him into the air. Norman turned his head and instantly got a blast of hot, stinky breath. He was staring into the eyes of a giant zombie. The clammy green zombie was 20 blocks tall, 15 blocks wide and 10 blocks long. The thing had a very gluttonous torso with surprisingly short legs and arms. The hands themselves were 4 by 4 by 4 blocks big. The head itself was minuscule compared to the body, but the breath was so immense that Norman wished he would die rather than stay there and smell the thing's breath. "Norman!" screamed Lizzie. Norman heard a whizzing noise and he saw a diamond arrow jam itself in the giant zombie's right hand. The zombie looked down at Bailey, who was readying another diamond arrow. He kicked her hard and sent her flying backwards into a giant banana pudding. Butterball managed to dodge the swipe, and he ran forward and blew up at the zombie's feet. Butterball could have hit the zombie with a pillow and more damage would be done. As soon as Butterball was fused together again, the giant zombie kicked him into the nearby pudding as well. "Anyway, what kind of food are you? Seafood? Junk food? You're not very plump, though," he grunted. Norman grunted and struggled to loosen the zombie's grip while gasping for a clean breath among all the stink breath. "Maybe if I eat all of you then I'll enjoy the meat. You're all much too skinny to eat individually." The great beast opened his mouth and Norman cringed as he was pulled close to the giant, dirty mouth. He gagged and shivered at the same time when he saw centipedes and cockroaches crawling around in between the monster's teeth. Suddenly, another diamond arrow whizzed forward and pierced right through the giant zombie's tongue. The zombie roared and fell backwards onto the ground with a boom, dropping Norman as well. Norman's breath was knocked out and he had a moment of panic. Hillary helped him up and stared at the giant zombie. "Norman, what is that thing?" "That," Norman muttered, gasping for clean air after nearly suffocating. "Is the zombie mutant? If I remember correctly, this thing is called Zombiulk. Professor Cowson said that, I think." Hillary took out an iron sword and ran forward to attack Zombiulk, who was struggling to get his immense body to stand. Lizzie yelled out with a battle cry and ran forward to join Hillary. Quinn didn't want to miss out on the action, so he tried to give a battle cry but it turned into something closer to a weak yodel. Norman ran forward and smacked Zombiulk's knee with shatter as hard as he could. With everyone smashing and slashing every inch of clammy skin, Zombiulk couldn't get up. Zombiulk reached out with both arms and desperately grabbed two giant drumsticks. He swung them around while on the ground, and Norman was swept off his feet. He smacked his head into the wooden ground and took on a bad headache. Norman stood up shakily and saw Zombiulk on his feet, charging towards him, swinging two giant deadly chicken legs. Norman dodged one swipe and heard Zombiulk speak. "I should bake you into a quiche." Norman dodged another attack, but then the other chicken leg smacked into him, and he fell backward. Shatter flew out of his hand and landed about 10 blocks away on a buttered roll. Norman grabbed the first thing to his left, which happened to be a huge fried shrimp. As Norman started deflecting Zombiulk's drumsticks with his own shrimp, he looked over and saw the other 6 watching him with strange expressions. "I assure you that this is the strangest thing I have ever done," he screamed. Zombiulk knocked the huge fried shrimp from his hand, so Norman grabbed a long loaf of French bread. He and Zombiulk went around in circles doing a sword fighting routine for a while, and Norman ended up fighting with a sausage whip, a bread knife, a pop-tit shield, and a bunch of other food-related weapons. Finally, Norman decided that he was done with all of this and he backed up quickly. He snatched up his previous sausage whip and tossed it forward so that it wrapped painfully around Zombielk's ankle. Zombielk lurched forward and Norman pulled to the side, making him trip over the sausage link. As soon as the monster's chin had hit the ground, Norman took the rest of the sausage link and wrapped it tight around its neck like a noose. Norman put one foot on Zombielk's shoulder and pulled backwards, tightening the sausage so that Zombielk was choking. Zombielk struggled to reach with his small arms to loosen the sausage noose. Then suddenly, just as Norman thought Zombielk was about to pass out, the monster bit down on the sausage around his neck. Norman jumped backwards and watched as Zombielk slurped up the whole sausage link like a strand of spaghetti. Norman expected Zombielk to come forward and eat him, but he just stood up and stayed still. Suddenly, he saw a green cloud of thick gas coming from behind, and a loud brap echoed through the air. Norman looked back up at the giant zombie and saw that the thing was smiling evilly at him. "Excuse me, this happens sometimes." Norman gagged as a terrible sulfur smell filled his nostrils. From out of the green gas behind Zombielk came a loud gurgle and some groans. Suddenly, Norman saw about 10 zombies emerging, all coming towards him at once. From about 3 blocks behind him, Quinn piped up. "Oh, crap. That thing can fart zombies. Incoming." Norman backed up to escape the terrible odor and was followed by the zombies. Soon after he heard 2 more braps from behind and 20 more zombies appeared. Norman knew that they couldn't take all the zombies at once. At that moment, Norman remembered that he had the one item they needed. Norman looked at his hotbar on his left arm and quickly put the boomstick in his hand. He hadn't used it in a while, and he was sure it was time. Norman hurtled boomstick at the 30 zombies and it blew up instantly, killing off 3 zombies. After it reappeared in his hand, he threw it again, killing 3 more zombies. He repeated this process 8 more times until all of the zombies were dead. Norman looked back up at Zombielk, who was merely watching with a slight amusement. Norman gripped the boomstick threateningly and that caused Zombielk to laugh. "You think that silly little toy can kill me? You must be joking! Now, get over here so I can put you into my quiche." Norman grimaced and threw the boomstick with all his might, but to his horror Zombielk leaned forward and opened his great mouth and swallowed the boomstick whole. Norman gasped and his stomach became painfully tight when the boomstick did not regenerate in his hand. Norman backed up and avoided the swipe of a drumstick. Bailey shot a couple more diamond arrows, but they all just landed on Zombielk's chest and didn't do any damage. Quinn ran forward and hacked away at Zombielk's foot, but Zombielk merely kicked him away and farted out 10 zombies that swarmed him on the spot. Norman looked from Quinn being attacked by 10 zombies to Zombielk swinging the drumsticks. He couldn't help Quinn, but he couldn't defend himself or anyone else from Zombielk. All seemed hopeless in that moment, but all of a sudden a voice echoed from behind. "Hey! You leave them alone." Norman moved his head to look around Zombielk. He almost stopped breathing when he saw who it was that had yelled. Esmeralda was standing there. She looked perfectly like Esmeralda with her wavy brown hair and rosy cheeks. The only thing that was changed was that her skin was green and clammy like a zombie's. Zombielk turned around and when he saw her he gave a half grunt half laugh. "Who are you supposed to be?" The zombified Esmeralda stepped forward and said. "I am Esmeralda Ironblock, and I'm here to fight with you." "Oh yeah? With what? Your fists?" replied Zombielk. Esmeralda put a large item from her hotbar and held it in both hands. It was a large metal instrument shaped into a long tube. There was a curved handle around the bottom and some supports attached around the piece of machinery, and at the end of the tube was a circular hole. Norman couldn't see what the ammo was, but he was hoping for something painful. "No, with this capsule cannon. I hope you don't mind going on a diet," she exclaimed. Zombielk's beady dark eyes widened and he backed up. He was about to make a run for it when Zombie Esmeralda pushed forward with the handle to press a button. A red pill the size of an exercise bin was shot from out of the opening. It jammed itself in Zombielk's mouth, and he swallowed it with difficulty. While choking slightly, Zombielk yelled, "No! Not raspberry ketone dietary supplements. Stop!" Zombie Esmeralda shot another pill. And another, and another. She kept shooting pills until they were cramming up Zombielk's whole mouth and throat. He gagged and made some choking noises. Norman noticed that Zombielk was consuming enough dietary pills where he was shrinking on the spot. Zombielk fell to the ground and choked on the pills some more, and by the time he had swallowed the last one he was the size of a regular zombie again. Zombielk groaned and held his stomach. "Ah, what's the point of having the name Zombielk if you're a beanpole?" Since no more pills could be swallowed, Esmeralda shot one last one and just crushed Zombielk underneath. Zombielk disappeared in a puff of smoke. Norman grunted as he rolled the giant pill away, and suddenly he found himself smelling the wonderful scent from previously. When he looked down at the source he found himself looking at Zombielk's doorway drop. The drop was actually a block colored a sickly greenish pink. It had lines and squiggles all over it with some gray areas among the colors. Norman picked up the doorway drop and a thought registered in his mind telling him the name. "This must be the brain of rot," he murmured. Norman placed the brain of rot on the ground and the scent in the air intensified. Norman found himself so mesmerized that he had a great urge to come forward and take a bite out of the rotting block. Before anyone around him thought about taking a bite, Norman bent down and chomped off a slimy bit. The resulting bitter flavor mixed with the sliminess made Norman's taste buds writhe in agony, but the smell was so amazing he wanted to take another bite. But a second after swallowing, Norman felt a pain in his stomach that was extremely sickening. He fell to the ground and groaned with pain, and Hillary came forward to help him. "That thing's poisonous. Here, take this milk." Hillary forced a bucket of milk down Norman's throat and the poisoning slowly faded. Lizzie came forward and yelled at him. "Norman! That was so gross. Why would you eat that garbage? You took a bite out of a rotting blob of zombie brains, for Notch's sake?" When Norman realized what he had really eaten he jumped up and tried to rub the remaining taste from his tongue. He spit a couple times and said, "Great, now if I burp later on I'll be able to taste this. Okay, I know it's called the brain of rot, but what purpose does it even have?" Zombie Esmeralda came forward while still holding her capsule cannon. That slimy block was Zombielk's prized possession. It is made up of gray matter that has been genetically altered by Zombielk's own saliva particles to enhance smell and attract unknowing victims. He used it to lure people down here with the amazing scent, poison them with it, and then put them in his different dishes while they were weak with poison. I believe that you could use this to lure your enemies into traps. The only downside is that you'd have to be careful not to entranced by the smell yourself," she explained. Norman punched away the block when he noticed that other people were beginning to look kind of out of it. This reduced the smell greatly so that no one was too entranced. Norman put the brain of rot in his block pack and then looked around for an exit. He noticed Shatter lying some blocks away, and he thought about whether it was damaged when he picked it up. Although, his thoughts were interrupted by a roar of groaning from behind. Norman turned around quickly and immediately saw about 100 zombies emerging from the darkness, all targeting their group. "Oh, Notch! This might get ugly." Chapter 25, Norman takes to the air. Norman yelled at everyone to back up. He bought them some time by rolling the giant raspberry ketone pill right at the giant wave of zombies. He thought they might all be plowed through, but the zombie in front stopped it with his hands and then pushed it back. Norman was waiting to see what the zombies were going to do since they were part of the Error's work, but they didn't seem to do anything that wasn't natural. Esmeralda came forward and headed right toward the zombies' ranks. I can't die from these mobs' attacks. Maybe I can talk to them and convince them to let us go. I speak zombies very fluently, she declared.